This meeting is being recorded.
Good evening and welcome. This is an open meeting of the Needham Finance Committee. I am Joshua Levy, Committee Chair. It's Wednesday, January 26th, 2022, and the meeting is being conducted remotely, consistent with current state regulations, and is being recorded. Public access to this meeting does not ensure that there will be public participation unless the law requires it. This meeting will not have public comment except in connection with the first item of business, citizen request to address the Finance Committee. First, I will confirm that a quorum of the members of the Finance Committee are present. When I call your name, please acknowledge your presence. John Connolly?
Here.
Barry Kaufman? Not here yet. Jim Healy?
Here.
Tom Jacob?
Here.
Rick Lunetta?
Here.
Louise Miller?
Here.
Nick Riley?
Here.
Carol Fischetti?
Here.
And Louise Misgard, our Executive Secretary.
Here.
The chair is also here. As a reminder, anything you share or state will be a matter of public record. As a preliminary matter, I would ask for a motion to continue the meeting to February 2nd, 2022 in the event of a technical disruption this evening.
So moved.
Second.
We'll take a roll call. Carol?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
Tom?
Yes.
Dick?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Louise?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes. So the first item on the agenda is citizen request to address the Finance Committee. I'm looking to see if there's anyone who'd like to address the Finance Committee. Please use the raise hand feature through Zoom, or if you're on a telephone, you can press *9. I'm looking right now and I don't see anyone raising their hand. Okay, so we can move on to the next item, approval of minutes of the prior meeting, January 19th, 2022. Has everyone had a chance to take a look at those?
Yes, I move their acceptance.
Second.
Okay, any comments? We'll take a roll call. Carol?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
Dick?
Yes.
Tom?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Louise?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes. So we'll move to the next item on the agenda, budget hearing for the Legal Services Town Council. This is on tab 5. Dave, if there, I assume, I see a lot of people on. Kate Fitzpatrick, I imagine she might want to join, the town manager. If she wants other people to join as well, we can have them added as well. In the meantime, I think John has a quick introduction.
Sure. I have. I'll handle this one, and I met with Kate and Chris Heap from Myers and Harrington on January 14th to review the town council budget for FY23. It's set forth in tab 5. It's essentially a level funded budget request in the amount of $329,140. This is the second year that the town has used Chris and his firm for town council services. As you know, Dave Tobin was a longtime town council for many years, and when he passed away, the transition was made over to Chris and his firm. It's been in effect for 2 years now, and it's been a positive experience from all that I can see and hear from Kate and others on the select board. That firm provides all services except for labor council, cable matters, and some environmental matters. And different than the situation with Dave, where part of the budget was allocated to a yearly salary that Dave received from the town. And then above and beyond that was billing that he did as the town's attorney. This budget here is all for outside billing that is done by Myers and Harrington to the town for work that's billed on an hourly basis for the town council services that are provided. And there was nothing sort of unusual this year with respect to any different matters or cases that required going to other council for any particular expertise. They noted that one of the big upticks they've seen in activity has been on public records requests. And that seems to be one of the many effects of COVID is people seem to be at home with computers and time on their hands and wanting to find out all kinds of information about texts and emails and other types of things that people who are involved in town matters are using in those town matters. So that's the report I have. And if anyone has any questions, please let me know.
Thank you, John. Kate, you have anything to add?
No, I think John summed it up. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Dick, go ahead.
Yeah, what I've just noticed, obviously, with outside counsel, it seems that the expenses is higher. Is any consideration being given to reconsidering the model we're operating under and trying to look at getting a permanent in-house counsel?
Kate, do you want to answer that?
Sure. The FY22 expenses, the FY21 expenses were higher than typical because of the federal lawsuit that the town began the defense of and is now under primarily under the jurisdiction of the town's insurer. So that was an expense in 21 that we don't expect to continue. I think the more important question is we felt that with a firm rather than an individual, we've had a lot of bench strength in areas where one person doesn't always know everything. So there are attorneys at Maris and Harrington who specialize in alcohol licensing, who specialize in environmental, who specialize in zoning, and who specialize in Eversource and things like that. So our counsel has been able to collaborate. He is our point of contact, but he's able to collaborate with other attorneys. We found that very useful.
Go ahead, Louise.
So I believe last year and the year before, we asked about possibly issuing an RFP for legal services. Is that something that the town is still planning on doing? And I would ask that we look at the fee structure and determine whether it may make sense to change it, since a certain level of fees are necessary just because we're a town. And I know that, you know, where I was just a town administrator, the fee structure was very different and legal fees were much lower as a result of that. But my first question is the RFP. My second one is the fee structure.
The fee structure, I can get you as a summary of where legal fees are generally in our types of communities. The board discussed issuing an RFP at its goal setting last summer and decided to keep on the current situation until at least next summer when they'll talk about it again.
I
Go
don't
ahead,
agree
Jim.
with that. I don't agree. I don't know why we are not doing an RFP. I don't know why we're not doing a procurement. So, you know, unfortunately, I work for another state institution and we have to procure all the time. So I don't understand that. So I would think that would be something that we would want to do. We may end up with the same firm. We may end up with a firm that's better, but I don't understand why we don't do it.
So I actually, Jim, I usually agree with you on almost everything, but this one I don't. I think that a lot of this has to do with relationship and level of confidence that you have working with people. And I think that, you know, RFPs for commodities or for really, really significant matters are necessary and important. But I think in something like this, where there's, you know, having a point of contact, having a relationship, having people, you know, and as they're developing, I think is important. And it's, I mean, this is $300,000 out of, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars of our salary. I just think that this isn't one where I would think an RFP would be the right place to be spending our time and energy.
So
Well, I would have done it. I would have done it at the start. So, you know, once you have a relationship, how can you say you have a relationship with someone that, you know, for 2 or 3 years? So
Go ahead, Louise.
Can I also, so I am also a lawyer and I am in the industry. And so I will question the fact that satisfaction, how is it that we're measuring satisfaction with a particular firm and the relationship with specific attorneys? And I know that that can be difficult, but in this instance, I didn't want to go down this road today, but I'm not sure that we are getting the best representation right now. And it might be a good idea to find out who else is out there. We may end up with the same firm, but I'm not convinced right now.
So,
And
I think
normally I do agree with you, John.
No, that's okay. It's good that we don't always agree.
Yeah.
I guess it's all good feedback. I think ultimately it's the select board's call. So we can, offer our suggestions, but I don't think we have a say in the ultimate decision. Does anyone
But
else
we
have any?
do on the level of funding.
That's true. I mean, if there's, if we think an RFP is going to result in lower fees or lower costs, I suppose that's a reason for us to push, but that's ultimately not even if that's the case, we're not the ones making the decision. Go ahead, Dick.
Right, and the caveat on that is you might get lower base costs, but you're also they're gonna be pushing it to people who probably don't have the right things that you're looking for in your town council, the town council that we would want for our town. So there's a lot to it other than just what you're gonna get back as a financial part of the response to the RFP.
Dick, go ahead.
Just a follow-up question to something that Kate said. If we think that fiscal 22 was an unusually high year for legal costs, why are we carrying forward into 23 the same expense structure?
We're carrying the number that we've had for the past 3 years. There are a lot of unknowns. Something else could come up. So the first year was a transition. Town council died in the very end of FY20. I think we don't have enough experience to know what the right number is. If it's truly legal expenses. If it's not used, it'll be turned back.
Kate, do we know what the turn back has been?
Last year it was in the hundreds, I think.
Hundreds of dollars or hundreds of
Yes,
thousands?
Dave, do you have that?
It was just under $4,000.
4,000.
Oh, okay. Any other questions or comments about legal counsel? Okay. We'll move on to the next item, municipal parking. That's tab 11. I see Karis and Cecilia. I guess I'll invite them in, and if they want other people to join as well, they can. The only thing I noticed in this was the big increase in mulching and weeding. I think that's based upon contracted pricing being updated. But other than that, I don't have any other questions. I'll leave that to Karis or Cecilia to describe or answer if they'd like to. Hi, Karis.
Hi. So did you want me to address the question on mulching and weeding?
Yeah, and if you want to just introduce, I know it's a smaller budget, but if you want to give a brief introduction, that's okay too.
So this is the budget that the Public Works Department uses in order to maintain the municipal parking lots in the town of Needham, as well as parking meters and other amenities in the downtown and the heights. The budget really has not shifted significantly in the last year. There's no increase in service. The main changes here are in the lease amounts for the lots that the town leases and does not own. And then, as you had mentioned, the largest increase we saw is in the contracted services for mowing and landscaping. The main reason, there are two things that sort of occurred when we went out to bid last for this service. The first is that we did see a price increase in general, and I think we talked about that when we presented the general DPW budget for this particular service. It's a very labor intensive endeavor. We don't allow any type of pesticide to be applied in Needham. So all of the weeding is done mechanically. So it requires a person to come in. That industry, the landscaping industry in general has been really dependent on seasonal labor that is brought in from out of the country, which did not happen in the last few years. And then because of COVID has also not continued to occur. So we've seen an increase in price over the past few years for this particular service. The other thing that happened when we went out to bid last is we actually bid all of our mulching and landscaping services together in one lump. So we do the schools, municipal parking lots, and public buildings. And so the low bid on this particular year they balance their bid differently than what we've seen in the past. So that's why the change is higher in municipal parking than you saw in DPW. It's possible, I think the old bidder just did a flat line, the same price for every single location. And this particular bidder actually looked at the square footage and adjusted their price accordingly. So you saw less of an increase in the DPW budget and a slightly higher increase in municipal parking.
Okay. And so we use the same contractor, you said, for all those different services.
We think that we get the best price having one contractor come into Needham. One advantage, obviously, of our parking lots is they're limited to when they can come in for the schools because of the hours of work and the utilization of those facilities. Our public buildings sometimes provide them the opportunity to come in earlier so they can start their work and then shift over to the schools afterward. And it's, we did end up changing it, and Cecilia, you have to correct me if I'm wrong. We had one company who did landscaping and one company who did mulching, and we found out, mowing and mulching, and we found that we were getting a higher price, or we were actually just not having companies bid on that particular project. So we ended up separating mulching and landscaping out.
Got it. Thank you. Do you anticipate, I guess, in future years that this, how do I phrase this? Do you think this is a one-time increase, or do you think in future bids that this might go down?
Again, I think it has to do with labor costs in the labor market. So it's really hard for me to say, going through my own hiring process right now and seeing where we're having difficulty recruiting and retaining staff. I can't imagine that the landscaping companies aren't also struggling in the same way. So it just depends. I think there's just so many variables between COVID, visas, and other things that would have an impact on this particular industry. So it might be a one-time jump, but it's certainly something that we'll evaluate when we put our bids out in the future. And I think as we talk about new buildings, new structures, and how we landscape our facilities, trying to get away from large mulch beds and move towards more densely organic materials. So that way we don't have to do this service quite as frequently.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions from the committee? Okay. Thank you, Karis. Thank you, Cecilia. The next, thank you, Dave. The next one is select board town manager. So if you could actually bring the town manager back in, we can discuss that. That's on tab 3 of our book. I think Jim has an introduction.
The town manager select board budget has 3 departments in essence. One is the select board, one is the town manager, and one is human resources. And the overall changes from FY22 to FY23 is 2.6% increase on the salary line of 32,000 and 12,557 in the expense line. The increase of 19,956 is basically with a result of steps and also a cost of living adjustment in the event that there is an increase to the ITWA. of the 12,557 portion of the total 32,000 increase. That's explained for you on page 25. One of the things that I wanted to know is the tech consulting for Powers Hall for 2,750, and that's because there are expected to be more public meetings that are held in Powers Hall, and when we do that, we have an outside vendor who comes and sets up in there. I did ask about the rent structure within Powers Hall, and the rent structure has not changed since we began Powers Hall. And so I asked the town manager if they'd be willing to consider looking at that, and she said she would. Obviously, there have been nothing from the middle of 2020 until now. So it's not as if there was anything that would be impacting the budget, but I think in future years, we should look to see whether or not we're keeping pace, especially if the cost of events and the cost of ticket prices for events, if that increases, then, you know, there should be a commensurate share with the town. In terms of the detail budget under the DSR2, there were some expenses that I didn't have a full knowledge of, so I wanted to go over them. And on page 27, under 1H, other compensation, that deals with economic development. The budget adjustments under line 1I deals with the number of days that are actually within the fiscal year, which can be impacted by how many weeks are actually within a fiscal year. And then the other compensation, as you may recall, is for the select board stipends of $7,800. I spent a little bit of time on the expenditure detail under section 5, page 28, because under professional and technical, it's quite a bit of money, $135,000. And there were some interesting things there that, you know, at some point, you know, maybe we'll have another discussion about, but we do have a consultant to whom we pay $23,000. That's the proposal for FY23 for employee engagement. And that, unless I wrote it down wrong, that particular vendor's been here for 3 years. This will be the 4th year. And admittedly, it's only $23,000, but that has not been procured since. In addition, the National Citizens Survey, $17,000. This is the same vendor that we've been using since 2008 and also has not been procured. I understand that there aren't a lot of people in the United States that actually do this type of a survey, and that there is some benefit to using the same vendor from a benchmarking perspective. I'm not entirely sure I understand the great value of doing a national citizen survey, a citizen satisfaction survey, which is done every other year. The other year, this company spends time working on other surveys. There's also a consultant that's used $3,000, and that's kind of a reserve, as I was told, for any other needs that may come up during the year within the Office of Town Manager. The community function line items seem to be higher than what I would have expected at $8,000 of the $9,200 under food and service supplies, but that apparently is because the Needham Business Association doesn't really get involved in a lot of the events that we used to have in downtown Needham. And the old Newton Needham Chamber, which is now, I think, called Charles River, if my notes are correct, they do a lot of those events at this point in time, but it does cost some additional amounts of money that used to be through donations. Again, these aren't huge sums of money, but nevertheless, we go through them. The travel and mileage, and a lot of that is conferences, 12,600. I don't know whether or not there'll be a lot of conferences in this fiscal year. I mean, if the COVID goes away, thank God, maybe there will be, but I know at least at the medical school, another state agency, we only allow travel for grant-related activities. And the dues and subscriptions to me seemed like a lot, almost $15,000. But of that amount, to pay the dues for the MMA and that Charles River Chamber is almost close to $10,000. My only, I have two last comments. One is that when I looked at the expenditures in the past versus the request for now, I know there's a lot of information here and there's a lot of answers that can be provided. But that being said, if you look at the budget that was expended in FY18, 933,000. When you compare it to the proposed budget for FY23 of 1,265,000. The difference between those two is $331,000 over a mere 5 years. In other words, a 36% increase. That to me is significant. Now, I'm not suggesting that the people that work in the department or the activities that they engage in have not increased. I have some detail, but not all the detail, but it does seem significant to me. Now, during that time, in FY18, the number of employees in this department was 9, 4 in human resources, 5 within the town manager and select board. In 2023, it's 10, 4 within human resources, 6 within town manager select board. So it's gone up 1 over those 6 years. And yet, you know, it's a almost $332,000 increase. And then another little, and again, you know, I'm not unlike most of you people, I'm not an accountant or an economist. I kind of do the best I can on these figures. But the next issue I think is really interesting, which is this department has 3 DSR 5s, no DSR 4s. So there are 3 requests that are being made within the town meeting warrant, separate and distinct from everything else. So although I understand the value of DSR 5s, and I called Dave to make sure I understood the value, you want to keep it out of the operating budget as much as you can, to the extent that it doesn't just add on to the operating budget. But if the DSR 5 has a reasonable likelihood to end up in the operating budget, then we're really not looking at the correct percentage increase from one fiscal year to the next, because you set it aside, you put it over there on the far right-hand corner, and then 2 or 3 years, maybe it's added in. And we saw that with the public information officer. So if you take and exclude the parking study of 135, I think it was, and you just look at the DSR 5s for the the 2 things were doing special events, which was all in the old days. It was done under the Cultural Council. I think there's a new name now. And then I think there was also some money for the a diversity study. And they were split over a couple of years. The diversity study was 100 over 2 years. The Cultural Council was split over 3 years. But roughly it's around 58 grand. But, and I know this may not be jibe with what all of you look at when you look at budgets. But when I look at it, I say, well, okay, so that's 58,000 that even though it's a DSR 5, in essence, it's part of operating, especially when you look at the fact that they want to continue this into the future. This is not a one and done. The parking study might be a one and done, but the other two are things that the select board want to do into the future. So if you add the 58 to the current budget request, the budget request actually comes up to be 1,323,000. And if you compare that first to FY18, just 6 years ago, the increase is a 42% increase over 6 years. To me, that's fairly dramatic. And if you just put all of the history aside and you compare it to FY22, you're looking at a 7.3% increase. And I apologize that this is a different way of looking at DSR 5s, but in my very short time here, it does seem to me that the goal of many of the DSR 5s is not simply a one-time thing, but ultimately there is a desire to move these things into the operating budget. And in large part, they do get moved in because instead of competing, as I said earlier, with all of the other items within the operating budget, there might be, I don't know, 300 line items. They have a separate warrant article. They're not competing against anything. And usually there is a constituency that is articulating a view for that particular expenditure. So I won't go into any detail on the DSR 5s because I just gave you an overview, but in essence, there are 3 of them, and I'll be very, very quick. One is for the 25,000, as I mentioned, which would complement monies received by the state for the Cultural Council, which they give us approximately $7,800, which is what they gave us in 2021. This $25,000 DSR 5 would be over 3 years, so about $8,300 each. Interestingly, one of the things about that is that it's not just to give out more grants, but it would be to allow the committee to potentially use the monies themselves to put on cultural events. The Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Program is a 2-year request. Again, $100,000, $50,000 per year. I'll leave it at that. And then the parking study is $135,000. That was an estimate that was provided to the DPW by one of our usual vendors. I don't know which one. Kate's going to get that to me. So in any event, probably too much information for a relatively low budget, but unfortunately, I guess they got me, which was probably the low straw, as they say. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Jim. And I guess just one, clarification when we're comparing. I think it's fine to look at the DSR 5s, looking at them compared against the operating budget as well. But I think comparing against prior years, we should include the DSR 5s that were in those prior years as well. So I think if you did that, the increase would not be as great. I mean, I think over several years, there have been other DSR 5s in the past. We look at surveys or we look at studies. So it's typical for us to have DSR 5s not identical to these, but similar to these. So the percentage increase might not be as great as what you said, Jim, but I understand your point that it has been large over time. Are there any questions about either the operating or the DSR 5s? Louise, go ahead.
On the DSR 5s, will we be having a separate presentation and discussion on each of them when we go through the warrant and they are separate warrant articles, or is this our time and place to speak about them?
No, they'll be, when they're in the warrant, we'll discuss them as well when they're there.
So
Go
I
ahead, Louise.
disagree. We need to talk about them right now because one of the questions is whether they do belong as DSR 5s or whether they belong in the budget and whether these are properly written so that we're not in a position where after the fact, we're commenting on the DSR 5s.
Yeah, I didn't mean to say that we can't talk about them here. I just meant that we will also talk about them when they appear in front of us in the warrant.
Okay. I have a number of comments on DSR fives.
Sure. Maybe we can start with the operating budget first. Does anyone have any questions about the base operating budget? Okay, so go ahead, Louise, about the DSR fives.
So on the first one, the Needham Council for Arts and Culture Programs, I do question whether this really is something these funds are to be spent under the direction of the town manager. Under state law, the Needham Cultural Council is a local cultural council. They have complete independence on how to spend the funds that are allocated by the state. And so one question I have is, who is going to be making decisions about how to expend the funds? If what we're interested in is supporting arts and culture from a state level, what was really important was that the cultural councils be independent. And I did serve on the Needham Cultural Council for as many years as state law allows. And I was chair for a number of those years. And I think it is really important for them to be independent. I also question whether the cultural council, what exactly their request was with respect to the programming that they're looking at. Anyway, so I would like to get a little bit more information from the Cultural Council about what it was that they were looking for. And I do not believe that these should be expended under the direction of the town manager, but should be dispersed like other Cultural Council funding directly to the Cultural Council to make decisions about.
Kate, do you want to give a background or respond to that question?
I guess only that under our, there are a number of items that are legally under the jurisdiction of the town manager for procurement and for sign off, but that departments spend under their own authority. There wasn't any intent, at least on our part, that we would be deciding on the grants. The reason that we've proposed it as a warrant article is because we think it bears testing to see whether there's sufficient use of them, how it works before we ask the finance committee in the future under DSR 4 to include it in the operating budget.
And
so may I suggest that it does not belong under the town manager's operating budget? We do have a number of committees that have their own budgets. So looking into the future, I think that if we want to add a committee that has a budget, it should remain with that committee. And Historical Commission is one. I think there are a number of them.
The Memorial Park trustee.
No, right, that one. But there are a number of them, and I would say that there are a number of miscellaneous committees that remain independent of town government in terms of decision making that occurs on those committees.
If I may, Mr. Chair,
Yeah.
Spent under the town manager means that if there's procurement or there's sign off, the Historic Commission doesn't actually spend its money. It just means that I sign off on it, and that's the intent here. If the request is made and the finance committee wants to consider a line item for other committees, including the NCAC, that's how we would do it in the future. But we really felt the pilot was necessary to see how it would work out.
Kate, I have a question. Are these funds in addition to the ARPA funds? I know there's some cultural funds that are being spent under as part of the ARPA funds that we've received.
Katie, could I ask Mr. Chair if Katie could answer that?
Sure.
Yes, these would be in addition to the ARPA. $20,000 was approved by the select board to support 2 mural projects that the NCAC would like to do, and that's what the ARPA funds would be dedicated to. And these are for supporting more of the grant applications they receive, and if they want to do a future project beyond that.
Were there ARPA funds for pop-ups as well?
Yes, but that project is under ongoing legal review for the final ARPA rules that were released. And were not an NCAC project. That was an economic development run project.
Okay, so this DSR 5 would be distinct from all of those ARPA funds and projects.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I guess we can stick to this specific DSR 5 if there are additional questions. Otherwise, we could go on to the other DSR 5s. Okay, so the next one is the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Program for $100,000.
So,
Carol, why don't you go?
so I was wondering, one, how the amount of $100,000 was determined, and two, if the DEI function will be a sole person responsibility, somebody within HR, will you actually be adding a temporary position to expend these funds? I'm just really interested in how this will be executed. And clearly, this is also a pilot program. So I would imagine the intent is, if it's successful, to bring this into the operating budget. So Kate, could you comment on all of those questions?
So the funding was derived from work that other communities had done, and working with our partners at the National League of Cities and looking at the estimates that they use for providing training for staff and elected officials. The goals of the select board would be to have a training and education and frameworks and tools for boards and committees, community groups and staff to be able to operationalize some of the NUARI, the Needham Unite Against Racism Initiative guiding principles. So I'm not trained to do that, and we don't have anybody on staff who's trained to do that training and to help groups think through their programs and services and how they might keep them the same or make changes to them. So this is not a study, and it's not a staff person. It is consultant, more likely more than one kind of consultant, maybe the National League of Cities, maybe more local consultants, to help us to do training programs and create frameworks. Anything that comes from this that might, communities around us have stop funding and receive funding for diversity, equity, and inclusion officers. That's not what this is, and that's not what we're asking for. If that is the case in the future that the board wants to ask for that, it would come in through a DSR 4. I would expect that this program is something that we're going to run, see how it works, see if anything else is needed, and then decide whether there's more one-time money that's needed, or whether there's money that would need to be put in the operating budget in 25 and beyond.
Thank you.
I saw Louise, then Dick, and then Jim.
So this is a comment directed to the Finance Committee. So when we receive or opine or fail to opine on some of the warrant articles that are resolutions, I actually think we do a big disservice to the town. And this is one where it was very clear that there would be financial consequences to the town. I think the financial consequences were only just beginning to uncover. And I think as we move forward through the warrant process, we need to really look at not just the actual wording of a warrant article. And if something is politically difficult, that doesn't mean that because the article is phrased a certain way, we don't opine on it because we can't determine what the financial consequences are going to be. We knew that there would be financial consequences, and now we are going to have to opine on the specifics of it. I don't have any specific statement about this particular one or specific questions. I think we'll be looking at it probably in more depth later, but I do think that we should have let town meeting know that there would be significant financial consequences at the time that town meeting voted the resolutions.
So
Louise, I don't disagree with you at all, but I guess what is our recourse is probably not the right word, but it's the word I'll use in that situation. Do we force a resolution to become a warrant article? You know,
So
it starts-
resolutions, unless,
this is like warrant creep, right? So
right, that is what it is. So first a resolution comes along. Next comes a standalone warrant article, which is really difficult because it's being argued on its own and has its own constituency, becomes really difficult to evaluate in the budget as a priority in the budget. And I think that some of it might be looking at the resolution and treating it, you know, if it were not. Some things are true resolutions and other things are not. Those that are not, and I think, I don't remember if we had a climate emergency resolution in Needham or not. I know a whole bunch of communities have had those, but like those kinds of resolutions have financial consequences. The fact that they're called resolutions simply is a way to create a priority for the Board of Selectmen. In my view.
In any event, we are going to discuss the financial implications of this when it comes to us as a warrant article. Excuse me, Dick, go ahead.
Yeah, the stated purposes of this are pretty broad. How will we measure whether we're getting any value out of the consultant services that are being performed? I think that's going to be very important because it's going to be very easy to say, oh, those were wonderful services and it's been great and we need to continue it. I think we need to have a very disciplined approach as to how to measure the value of the monies that are expended under this.
Is that a question?
Well, I guess I'll phrase it as a question. Is there a way to evaluate the success or value of the services?
I think there is, as Dick said, I think it has to be very disciplined. The scope of service has to be very clear. I do think that part of the deliverable can be, how can we measure what success is? We'd have to look at, take a case study of an individual department, an individual ward, or a community organization that's participating, and set some objectives to what would be evaluated and what might the outcome be before we spend the money on seeing if that can be done. So I agree with Dick that it has to be pretty rigorous.
We got to be very careful. If we're asking the consultant to evaluate the value of the consultant services, I think there's a high probability they'll conclude that they are extremely valuable.
Yeah, I agree with that. What would be helpful is to develop what success looks like from a project perspective.
Consumer's perspective.
If it's successful, then you can assume the consultant might have been worth it.
Yep.
Jim, go ahead.
So I don't agree with the resolution. And this is all being driven by the resolution, and it's being driven by the Board of Selectmen's select boards, view and vision as to what the resolution means. I copied it. I have it. I read it for the 5th time. And I don't agree that we need to learn a more complete version of American history. I don't agree that our people are treated inequitably with respect to public safety. I don't agree that people are treated inequitably in all town-related activities. I don't believe that in the town of Needham, that there is a dominance of white culture and privilege. And in Needham, I do not believe that we have implicit bias. That's just my view. Maybe one of 32,000 people, but it's my view. Someone who's been here and was raised here and born here in 1959. And yet there's a rush to put money aside, taxpayer dollars, which could be used for affordable housing, could be used to fix Chambers Street, which we certainly need to do. These people who are veterans and they're living in squalor. So do I feel, excited about this? Yes. Am I agitated? No question about it. And before, I was kind of told, it's just a resolution, just, relax, Jim, relax, Jim. But we all knew this was going to happen. And so here we are. So listen, I'm going to get outvoted, whether it's here or at town meeting or anywhere else. But at least someone needs to speak up for some large percentage of the town of Needham that doesn't believe that they're doing things wrong. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Jim. I guess I would say that I mean, if residents or members of other departments or the community, think that there are ways of spending these monies other than on consultants to achieve some desired aims of the town, then we have open every meeting we begin with citizen request to address the finance committee. So we're eager to hear members' thoughts. We'll talk about this again certainly when this is part of the warrant. Are there any other questions or comments?
I guess I would just comment a little bit on Jim's point. Let's assume that he is totally correct in what he said. Nonetheless, town meeting spoke and adopted the resolution. And as we said, we all knew that implicit in adopting that resolution would be that monies would be spent under it. So it seems to me the role of the finance committee now is to measure to see if that money is being spent in a prudent manner, not whether it should be spent at all.
Dick, I love you dearly, but I don't agree with you.
Well,
I think we still have a role. We still have a role in making a decision whether or not the expenditure of these funds is reasonable and appropriate as compared to other requests that are being made. And there are other DSR 4s and other DSR 5s. And frankly, I might be one person who says, I'd rather fund this, and this would be a better value to the town and a better use of taxpayer dollars than that. So, and I also think, Dick, I don't think people, if you remember, how much discussion was there on this resolution? People were fatigued. They were tired. And I don't think people were willing to look at not just kind of the grand, language of it, but to look at the practical impact as to what it would mean from a budgetary perspective. I'm not sure that was really on the table. I don't disagree with your comment, but I think
I'm not sure we're that far apart, Jim, because I think absolutely we have a duty to look at this and decide whether this is a worthwhile expenditure of dollars. Absolutely, that's our function. I don't think relitigating the initial vote is a good use of our time.
I don't want to relitigate the vote.
Just
Go ahead,
one-
Carol.
Thank you. I guess where I come out on this though is getting back to Louise's initial comment is that, or my question is, did we kind of abrogate our duties as a finance committee since we took no position on the resolution? And should we have forced the quantification of what the financial implications might have been at the outset? Because then we would not be having this discussion.
I think at that time it would have been a guess. I don't know what we would have based a financial estimate on at that time.
But the thing is, Josh, I think it's important to highlight the fact that there is a financial implication. And I think town meeting is thinking, well, it's a non-binding resolution, and we didn't take a position on it.
But
Go ahead, John.
we are going to take a position on this one. We now have something finite to discuss and vote on and recommend to town meeting. There was nothing finite financially before us back then. So I think that we knew we were going to get to this, and now our role is to act on it in the way that Dick and Jim suggested. We're going to view this against all the other requests that come in, whether this 100,000 versus 100,000 for a new HVAC technician to keep up with the HVAC needs of the town and all the other things. We're going to weigh it and see where our money what we recommend the priority of the money should go to. So we now have something concrete to react to versus other concrete things. That's what we do. And so I think, you know, I have no issue with what happened before. And I look forward to this discussion because I think it's going to be an excellent one.
Well,
Go ahead.
but because it's a DSR 5, we don't weigh it against an HVAC technician. HVAC technician is in the budget. This stands alone.
That's why I'm not in favor of DSR 5s, because I think they were a great idea. Davison had a wonderful idea. It was very sound, fiscally prudent. And I think there's kind of been a misunderstanding or a different interpretation of what DSR 5s mean. And I would much rather have seen this as a DSR 4, where we could actually look at it from a budget perspective, overall budget. But I'm new to the committee, so I apologize if I'm offending anyone or if I'm, you know, just not understanding the whole background of this.
I mean, DSR 5s are in the warrant, they're outside the budget. I think sometimes, I think the general intent was that they would always be outside the budget. I guess, Kate, from a policy, or Dave, from a policy perspective, do you want to add input to that?
I think that we've directed people for things that are not intended to be long-term, that they be put in a warrant article so that they don't become part of the budget that, you know, next year, frankly, we're going to have to try to be pulling back. So it's a, you know, if it's a one-time or a multi-year project, that's an example of the kind of thing we like to see as a warrant article rather than embedded in the budget that would make it go up and down.
Respectfully, I just don't think that's what's happening, Kate. I think that was the plan. I think the idea of it, the original concept, was sound, but I don't think that's what's happening. I think people have realized we have an opportunity here. An opportunity is to go to the DSR 5. We don't have to argue within the budget, and therefore it's a standalone. We get people that are built in to be voting for or against. There's probably political issues, agenda issues, and the public information officer is a perfect example. Started out as that, and then all of a sudden it's now in the budget. And I think you're going to see the same thing with the Council on Aging, and I think you're going to see the same thing with Newari. But anyway, that's just my view.
Are there other questions about this DSR 5, Tom?
I'm just trying a little background, Jim. We were the ones that wanted the public information officer to be a warrant article. We pulled it out of the budget because we didn't want it to be embedded because we didn't know if it was going to be successful or not. So we have to weigh which items we wanted to see our test project or something that we really want to have long term. And so some should be DSR 5s, some maybe should be DSR 4s.
I know, and that's why I said I apologize, because I wasn't there when all these decisions were made. I agree with them.
But there's a big difference between the finance committee recommending that something be pulled out of the budget and something be presented as a separate warrant article. Because, so would we put it back into the budget if we thought that's where it really belongs?
I mean, that's why
I'm wondering if we set the tone, then people are trying to say, well, this is probably something. So it's a good, reasonable question. I don't know the answer, but I think we may have set it in motion by pulling things out in recent years. I'm only guessing why people may be doing it this way.
But I think that's why it's good to have this discussion now, because before we have a vote on the budget, we can see if it is appropriate to put it into the budget or not.
So I don't know I hope I'm not betraying any confidences, Kate. You've already submitted your thing, right?
Yeah, well, we made the presentation last night. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And I think you had mentioned, you had foreshadowed to me that there could be around 12 DSR 5s, right? Is that, I could be wrong, but.
I think I said that about the 4s, but I think there's probably in the 5s, there's fewer than that are new, that aren't, those routine ones. I can get them.
No worries.
I have them.
No worries. My point is, I think we're going to see more and more DSR 5s as we move forward, unless we come up with maybe a better way of how we want to deal with them. That's all my point is.
Okay. Anything else on this? The next one then is a parking study, 135,000. Louise, go ahead.
So I thought we had a parking revolving fund somewhere or some type of a parking fund. And could this be paid for out of that? Dave
go
is
ahead.
ready.
Mr. Chair, yes, that will be the town manager's recommendation.
So that would be the source of this funding,
Yes,
but it still has to be appropriated by town meeting.
still must be a town meeting action.
And what's the current balance in that fund?
379,000.
And what, out of curiosity, I'm not as familiar with this fund. What's the source of that money?
It is the residual monies from parking receipts when they used to be reserved for appropriation by town meeting. And several years ago, when the state did the Municipal Modernization Act, they made parking meter receipts and others general funds, and they're credited directly to the general fund, and they're part of the appropriations that are made by town meeting.
Okay, thank you. Carol, go ahead.
What, I'm just curious, Kate, when was the last time that a parking study was completed?
Do you know, Kate?
I
Yeah,
somehow.
there was
more
a like an MAPC or a economic development grant, maybe mid 2000s that had done, but that was one that was really looking at all of the parking in Needham Center, public and private, and whether there was a way to consolidate so that there would be more access. This one is a little bit different. This is really intended for on-street and municipal parking lot parking, and whether it's sufficient and whether there are other ways that the parking can be structured, because there's a lot of interest from a lot of quarters with respect to how, for instance, Great Plain Ave, Chapel Street, Highland, and Highland in the Heights are used, and whether it's a better use for bike lanes, travel lanes, on street, on sidewalk parking, those kinds of things. So if you wanted to add more on-street dining, you're gonna have to take out parking, and the question is, where could it go, and is it gonna be needed?
Who owns the Walgreen lot? Walgreens or?
It's a trust. It's a trust in New York City, and every 10 years or so, we try to get them to make an arrangement with us, but we haven't been successful.
It's the old First National family,
Yeah.
Dick, the supermarket chain.
Keith's, was it?
I don't remember the name. I just know that, that was the old finest First National. And they've held on to the property, and they own property throughout the entire United States. So I do, Josh, had my hand up. So.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought, yeah, go ahead.
No, that was me there. So couple of things on this one. And I think what Kate said is very, very important. We're not looking to create more parking behind CVS or Jacob's Shoe Store or wherever. They're actually looking at something a little bit more different here, which is, do we have more bike lanes? Do we have pedestrian walkways like downtown crossing? So this is kind of the next phase. It's really not parking as much as it is, what do we do with our roadways? And off-street outside dining is one of the components. So my only concern is that, these roads, they haven't changed a heck of a lot over the past, 30, 40, 50 years, at which time, we're still trying to move motor vehicles in through the town. So the only thing I said to Kate is I just caution that, we still have people that want to drive at the same time, people who want to walk, people who want to ride a bike, and people who want to have a dinner. And I just think it's a lot to ask for a very, very tight area. So and the other thing I asked Kate, I don't know if you were able to find out, but the back of the envelope number of this 135,000, who was it that provided that to us?
The firm is TEC. I didn't get back to you because I didn't get what it
No
means.
worries.
It's
No wor- no-
TEC.
Yeah, no worries. No,
Dave may
thank
know
you.
the final name.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Any other questions about the parking study? Okay, again, we'll discuss these DSR 5s again when we see them in the warrant. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Katie and Chuck. The next item on the agenda is townwide expenses on tab 2. This is separated out on the agenda, looking first at health insurance, OPEB, retirement, workers' comp, injured on duty, and classification, performance, and settlement. Carol, do you want to give an intro?
Sure. I didn't, Josh, like separate them out that way, but
It's okay.
I wasn't really quite sure why you pulled them out like that. But at any rate, so I just, Dick and I met with Dave and his team this week actually to talk about townwide expenses. And overall townwide expenses, the base rate increase year over year is 3.73% or 2.35 million from 2021. Some of the more significant things that are driving that obviously are a decrease, albeit very temporarily, in debt service expenses, a decrease in workers' compensation this year, an increase of 9.5% in retirement assessments, and a 4.5% increase in OPEB expenses, and a 6.8% increase in Needham Electric Light and Gas program. So if you want to talk about health insurance, OPEB, retirement, workers' comp, and injured on duty, let's do that first. And then Dave, if I'm, or Dick, if I'm saying anything that's not quite right, please let me know. Casualty, liability, property, and self-insurance is increasing by 9.9%. Part of this is the base increase is about 6.6% for fiscal year 2023. What is driving this is both rate increases and increase in property values that are insured year over year. So the increase in total property value is 5.1% and will include fire station 2 and police station later on this year, which was not included in last year's budget. Dave, is that correct way to look at that?
Correct. They're included in the current year budget, but only for a portion of the year, because we knew Station 2 would come online in FY22, but only for a portion of the year. And the same with the police station, but we have 12 months of premiums to cover in FY23.
Okay, thank you. Group insurance is increasing by 1%, and that's made up of an increase of 5% in health insurance premiums and a slight decrease in total active enrollees of 3.5%. That also includes in the budget a provision for 20 employees that do not participate in the group health program, but you're assuming that in the numbers. Is that correct, Dave?
Yes, that's
okay. And
Dick, did you have something to add?
Yeah, this is subject to adjustment with
Right.
the DSR4s because they involve a lot of people. And as you recall, each DR4 at the bottom has an item for benefit costs, which won't be in that operating department's budget. It will swing into this budget here.
but it's not in here right now.
Correct.
Okay, right. And then the other caveat in group insurance is that the rates are for 2023 are still not available and not factored into this budget. Is that correct?
No, I thought they did come in this one. We lost one
They-
insurer. And so they went with the other insurer and they came in with
Okay,
quotes. There may be suspect for next year because I think there's some question as to how careful the quote was for fiscal 23 because they had to hurry it up. Who dropped out, Kate?
Fallon,
Fallon dropped out, and so whatever picked this up, and we may be looking at a more substantial increase next year.
mhm. Okay, OPEB. Dick, this is your expertise, so then you might want to talk about this one. But let me give it a try. The town has a funded ratio of their OPEB liabilities of 35.7%. And slowly, with Dick's advice, over the last several years, they've reduced the discount rate from 7.75% in 2017 to 6.75% in 2021. And there was a discussion of trying to go to 6.5%, but it was difficult to affect that in this budget. So they'll leave this remaining at 6.75% for 2021. I'm sorry, fiscal year, 2021. Retirement assessments increased by 9.5%. And the funded status as of January 1st, 2021 was 67.4%. The retirement board reduced the discount rate for retirement assessments from 7.25% in 2020 to 6.5% in 2022. And ideally, both the OPEB and the retirement assessment discount rates should be the same, but we're not quite there yet. Getting close. In terms of workers' comp, that decreased by 14.2%. And Dave, if you want to talk about the injured on duty and the 111F expenses, which was just provided for in last year's, that would be great.
Either town manager or I can address it, but quickly, we sought town meeting approval to adopt a reserve just as we have for workers' compensation. Folks may not be aware that, of course, the workers' compensation appropriation, if not completely used, can be retained to pay the future costs associated with claims that result from the fiscal year that the monies were appropriated. But we could not do that for public safety officials. Public safety, police, and fire are not covered in Massachusetts under workers' compensation. There's a different statute that effectively works the same way as workers' compensation. It's a little different. And that's what the 111F means. It's actually chapter 111F. And we will have a fund which is just like the workers' comp will be a separate appropriation line. And in both situations, we will be presenting financial warrant articles to contribute to the funds to meet the targets that the fund should be at based upon the audits.
Thanks, Dave. I'm sorry, Kate, did you have anything to add to that?
Dave did a great job. Just to note that we are recommending a new line item under workers' comp for 111F. So there would be a split. Instead of having it all in workers' comp, we would recommend a new line item in the townwide expense.
Got it.
So in effect, the reduction in workers' comp is offset by the increase in the 111.
Yes.
Right.
And Carol, did you have an overview of the classification, performance, and settlement as well?
Yeah, I have just a mention. Yes, I have debt service, Needham Electric, and classifications and settlements. So classifications and settlements is really just due to the outstanding collective bargaining agreements that have not yet been settled. That includes the Needham Police Union and police supervisor officers for 2022. And Dave, I did have a question on that. Does that still include Needham Fire for 2021?
Yes.
Okay.
We do not have a collective bargaining agreement with Needham Fire for 21, 22 and the out years. And the police, we don't have an agreement for 22 in the out years. And the contracts with NIPIA and the and BCTIA, which is the custodian trades, expires this year.
And actually, I had another question about the classification, performance, and settlement. In speaking with the school department, units A and B are currently renegotiating for next year. I'm curious how it'll be treated if, for some reason, it's settled before the end of the year, but after the budget is submitted.
This reserve doesn't include the schools. They have to build that into their operating budget.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Dave.
Just a process question. If a given contract doesn't get approved in the fiscal year, monies have been set aside in this account, do they wash through to free cash in future years? So in effect, there's a cost we know we're going to have to incur, but that loads it all into the subsequent fiscal year instead of spreading it over a couple of fiscal years, right?
It's true that we had a reserve in FY21 for the fire union and it expired because we couldn't reach agreement. It's very rare. We try really hard, but there's a whole new team there and it just didn't happen. So yes, it's built into this one. It would have been better if we had settled in the last year.
Hmm.
Go ahead, Carol.
Oh, no, go ahead, Josh.
No, that was it for me.
Okay, so then the other expenses include debt service, which has gone down this year by 2.7%, and that will be short-lived given the approval of Emery Grover design and the likely approval of a financing for Emery Grover at spring 2022 town meeting. Needham Electric.
Can I ask a question about debt service before we move?
Sure. Go
Sure.
ahead, Louise.
So I think it was 6 years ago, maybe, that the town approved a debt service stabilization fund. So when we're looking at the debt service line, there really are two components. And I'm curious to know whether there are any plans to use the debt service stabilization fund to address the fluctuations in the debt service, because as I look at this, I think there is an increase in the debt service within the levy, and even though there's a decrease in excluded debt. Might be wrong, but I'm just curious on how we're going to be using the debt service stabilization fund so that we're not just increasing the debt service line within the levy.
Kate or Dave?
The debt service stabilization fund is a reserve for the out years when we look at some of the pending projects to be taken up on the town. The debt service within the levy limit is consistent with the policy at 3%, and that's how we build our debt plan and our amortization of debt in the out years. And the one of the purposes of the debt service stabilization fund is if we had a piling up of projects that would have pushed the debt service within the levy limit beyond the 3%, that fund would have been able to keep the debt service below 3%. That is not an issue right now. Carol was making reference to the potential impact of the debt service increasing should excluded projects be approved in the coming future. Excluded debt will continue to decline, and unless and until a new project is appropriated to be funded by excluded debt. And in the case of the CPA, that is declining every year, but as we note, there is a project that's under consideration with CPC that would have a portion of the debt service supported by CPA receipts. So there's a potential that would increase.
Go ahead, Dick.
In my understanding of the 3% within the levy concept is it's not a ceiling so much as it is a direction that as a matter of policy, the town should spend 3% of its base budget on capital items. So it's the idea is we should continuously invest in make capital investments going forward, and 3% is a number we strike for. So rather than reducing it, that's a number that we should seek to spend every year.
Well, I don't, so I think it's a combination, Dick.
Well, I think if you read the language, it's written very differently from the 10%.
Yeah, no, I was kind of around there at the time that we did this, which was 1997 or 8. So I beg to differ there. So you're right. Half of your argument is we should seek to spend up to 3% within the operating budget so that we can take care of some of the capital projects that then don't leak into the 10% cap and other capital spending. But at the same token, it's also a cap. So it's both. It's both. It's got two different purposes to it. Yes, we want to spend money within the operating budget, but yes, we don't want to exceed the 3%. So it's both.
And my understanding.
Let me just read the two lines. 2, the town will strive to limit total debt service, including debt exclusions, blank, 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 to 10%. The next is item 3, the town will allocate or reserve 3% of projected general fund revenue for debt service.
Well, I don't know who rewrote that, but that wasn't what it was in 1997.
That's how it reads now.
Well, then we should change it. All right, or I'll make a motion to change it. Because that should not be, we should not be artificially enforcing that we borrow so much money within the operating. It should be a policy decision that is made by all of us. We should all weigh in and decide whether or not if the expenditure of these funds should be 2.5, 2.8, 2.9. And frankly, when I was a selectman, one of the things we advocated is whether or not we should go to 4%. Because it was our view that if we had monies within the operating budget that could be used to fund capital as opposed to funding operations, that might be a better use of those funds. So I don't know who changed it. I don't know who put it on the last page as opposed to the front page where it used to be. But I can tell you that having been there at the onset, Dick, that's not what the purpose was.
Okay, that's the way it's read since I've been on the finance committee.
Not how it was written.
I've read it the way I've seen it the way Dick has read it, and I agree it could use some clarification because they read differently. And my understanding of the intent is that they should not be different; that they should be actually more similar. But my understanding, Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the 3% has never been exceeded. Correct?
Yes, to to the point that Mr. Healy meant, that we view the 3% as a ceiling in terms of debt within the levy limit.
Mhm.
And that's how we do our planning in terms of projects that are financed by debt within the levy limit.
And Dave, you've never had to utilize the debt stabilization fund to achieve that 3% threshold, have you?
We have
Have we?
not as yet. Projects that we were anticipating that might have that impact are still pending. Still pending.
And Dave, can you remind me what our target for that debt stabilization fund is and what the current balance is?
There's not a target per se, and we haven't put money into it for several years now. It's what drives that is what the outlook is in terms of projects that would be financed in the future, and how we want to smooth out the impact of those projects, and that would help give guidance of how much more we would put into the fund. One of the things that the town manager is contemplating is with the if the former Muzzy site is developed in such a way that generates new growth revenue, that perhaps before it just slides into operations, that those funds could be set aside for the purposes of helping to finance items such as the coming school projects, to make it much more reasonable in terms of the impact on Needham residents.
Thank you, Dave. Other questions on debt service or on other aspects of the townwide expenses? Go ahead, Dick.
Yeah, I think we need to have a discussion, the reserve fund.
Yeah.
So yes,
I won't step on your lines, Carol, if you want to start.
No, go ahead. No, because that was, that's what's left really, is to talk about the reserve fund and how much of that reserve fund we might expend with this weekend snowstorm.
I think, as everyone knows, there's a formula that we've used for some years now in arriving at the reserve fund calculation. We exclude from the budget items not subject to reserve fund, like townwide expenses and so forth, but then take a percentage of that and use that as to drive what we conclude would be the reserve fund amount. Applying that formula this year, we would come up with a reserve fund of 2.2 million, an increase of almost $150,000 over the current year. As you can see from the materials that are in the book, for some years now, we have not had significant drawdowns on the reserve fund, largely because, as Carol indicated, Mother Nature has avoided us in terms of major snowstorms. Years past, that's been an $800,000 to $1 million number. We're not in the business of predicting it this year, so one would expect that, at least as a going basis and a placeholder, we might stick with our formula. But I think we need to put a disciplined eye on that reserve fund to the extent that allocations to that fund are crowding out support that otherwise would go to projects. I think we seriously need to look at whether we need a reserve fund in this level or not. But I would reserve that till we get a better view of the overall budget.
I think,
And I think that in the next couple of years, there may be need of the reserve fund for some other expenses that are not normally included in there. And I'm specifically thinking about health insurance. I think that, what happens with health insurance is very much up in the air right now. And there may be a need for some draw on the reserve fund. So I would just add that to the equation.
I was just gonna say, we often talk about the uses of the reserve fund. So if you want it, if the committee wants to take some time to discuss that more now, I'm happy to do that.
I think it's a good idea to have a single reserve fund here rather than having each department squirrel away contingency funds. So I think we ought to have a policy of reasonably liberal allocations out rather than having people pad their budgets to cover contingencies.
Well, we should also look at the turn back, which I know, Dick, you've done historically.
Yep.
And see whether or not the turn back is appropriate for the budget. So, you know, if we have 4 or 5% on a regular basis for any number of years, that means the budget's inflated. Dave told me his position on this was, I think, 2.9%, 2.8%, somewhere around there.
You know, 2.5 to 3 has been the custom.
Right. So, you know, that might be, maybe that's another factor we should look at.
Okay. I'm happy to have a larger discussion about the reserve fund at another time, if anyone would like.
Josh, can I just ask?
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
The conversation about the debt management policies, which we began either last meeting or the meeting before, has now really piqued my curiosity. So what I'd like Dave Davison to do, I don't mean to make work for my old pal, but I really would like to see what those policies were in the 1990s and to see whether or not there's been changed language. God forbid that if I was the one that approved the changed language, but I'd just love to see, you know, how we got to where we are, and maybe we can have a discussion with the select board about, you know, potentially revising them if we think that it's appropriate. But I'd like to see where we are and where we've been.
Yeah, I mean, Dave, if there have been any changes, that would be helpful to see. I understand, though, that the 10% and the 3% are long-standing, and
well, just remember, Josh, it wasn't. It started as 2%. You know, I'm so goddamn old that I was there when it was 2%. So that's how it all started. At 2% and 10%, then it went to 3%. And as I said, there was discussion about moving it to 4%. And listen, I don't want to make work for anybody. I'm not trying to be a pain in the neck, but I guess I would kind of like to understand where we were and how we've gotten to where we are now. And maybe where we are now is perfect. It could be. And I don't want to bother anyone else. So if Uncle Davey wants to send it to me, I can look at it and then share it with the rest of the group. That'd be fantastic.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that would be helpful. Thank you, Dave, if that doesn't take too much time. Okay. Any other questions about townwide expenses? Okay, thank you, everyone. This is a helpful discussion. Thank you, Kate, Dave, Katie, Chuck, everyone. Thank you, Evelyn. The next item on the agenda is a school master plan update and discussion. I thought this would be helpful. This is in the context of, Dave mentioned it previously in our conversation about townwide expenses, that there are discussions and plans that are being developed on how to address some of our aging school buildings, in particular Mitchell and Pollard, but there are also some other school buildings that could be affected. So I thought it would be helpful to have just a general overview first to make sure that everyone's on the same page, and then a discussion about what any positions that the Finance Committee would like to take at this point, or reserve for a later point in time. So let me share my screen and Can everyone see my screen right now?
Yep.
Okay,
Mhm.
so I'll walk through some of these slides. If there are questions, feel free to interrupt me. I can't see everyone's screen, so please interrupt me. Don't raise your hand. It's possible I might answer your questions over the course of this presentation, though. So just as a background, there was an original school master plan which was presented to us and other committees in October 2020, and that was done by Doran Whittier, our consultants. Following that, there were several discussions, and there was a facility financing working group that was convened in the summer of 2021. And over the course of the discussions, it appeared that the desired or the recommended proposal that came out of the school master plan at the time was in some ways cost prohibitive and had both Mitchell and Pollard being reconstructed at the same time. And so in August 2020, the Finance Committee approved a reserve fund transfer to extend the school master plan to look for ways to either reduce the overall costs or extend those costs over a greater period of time so that the impact on the 3% and the 10% limits were lessened. So that school master plan extension working group convened 7 meetings between September and December of 2021. And that extension report was released in January, so this month. So there have been presentations in front of the PPBC, the school committee, and I think that may be it so far. There will be future presentations on this as well. So here's just a quick agenda of what I want to go through tonight. I'll talk about first the challenges. So why are we talking about this in the first place? So the conditions at Mitchell and Pollard pose challenges both for providing educational space and also for maintaining the physical buildings. This is a schematic, just a color coding of the conditions at each of those schools. And you can see that Mitchell fares poor in several of these categories. Pollard is fair in several of those categories. In addition, at High Rock, though it's in very good physical condition, it is overcrowded as a 6th grade school. And here's another chart. I'll spend a little time explaining this chart. So,
Josh, can I ask I don't understand.
Yeah.
So High Rock's been open now as a 6th grade center for over 10 years. I think like around 12 years or so. And my understanding is that the enrollment has pretty much been it's been pretty constant. As a matter of fact, it might even be less now than it was at certain points during the 10 years. So I don't understand where this sort of overcrowding, and I don't think that's the right word for it, is existing. And have they provided you with any sort of backup or justification for using the term overcrowding?
So over the course of the extension meetings, a theme was that there was certainly not enough special education space at the grade 6 center.
Well, that's a lot different than overcrowding.
So that the second part is based upon this chart. So looking at the capacity assumptions. So all of these lines are different enrollment forecasts out to 2035, 2036 school year. The purple line is the most recent forecast, and the other lines are forecasts from last year. So
how about going
data.
the other way? How about showing from 2010 to 2020?
Yeah.
So you can really accurately measure, it, because I just don't think this is a good way to look at it, because it's been going on for 10 years with the same conditions. So when I've never heard about overcrowding in those 10 years.
Yep. I don't have that data, but we can
Okay.
certainly
so I
ask
just want
them
to
for
point that out.
One of the assumptions about the capacity assumption is this assumes a 71% utilization rate, meaning that at any given time, 29% of the rooms or space isn't being used, and you need some slack when there's
So,
rooms that are moving around. But I'll just say,
so we've
the-
had this
well,
discussion though
Louise,
about,
I just want to say one thing.
yeah,
So the MSBA guidelines for middle school is 85% utilization. So there is slack built in here with the 71% assumption. And when I asked this during the meeting, it was in anticipation or to allow for additional enrollment should that arise. Go ahead, Louise.
so I was gonna say, even at 85%, I think you still need to look carefully at what those assumptions mean. And John, that was way back when High Rock opened. It was like 2008 or 9. It was in that range. It was a long, long time ago.
Been open, right, I thought over 10 years.
Yeah, and there was a point in time at which it definitely had 450 kids. I don't know what the enrollment, I didn't keep track of the enrollment, but I know there were definitely 450 kids there.
It's 450 right now.
Right,
that-
and it's been like that.
So that's John's point. It's been relatively flat.
So it's possible we can ask for clarification, but my understanding is that special education needs have changed in this building and that there are not enough rooms to accommodate all of that. One thing to note here, and this comes up in some of the scenarios that the consultants looked at, is that High Rock would not be overcrowded as a 3-section elementary school. So and that's because there is no utilization rate assumption that's needed at the elementary school because the school students are not moving around classrooms. There's no need for slack space in that sense. So there's less, you can accommodate an elementary school in a similar amount of space, whereas you could not, whereas right now this middle school is has a bit more students than the school department is comfortable with. Are there other questions about that before I move on?
So how does a 3-section elementary school solve any problems that we're currently facing in the school department?
Indirectly, I'll get to that later in the proposals. So the other challenge, of course, is what we were talking about, the cost. So rebuilding multiple schools will, of course, require issuance of debt. And Needham's 2 debt policies, as we just mentioned, the 10% and the 3%, I think are limits that we should be very careful not to exceed, or if we do exceed them, we should be very careful to have a plan of how we're going to come under them. And so I think this is also a challenge that we need to address. So now I'll get to the proposed scenarios to address these challenges. These are 4 scenarios. Up top are the 4 scenarios in prose. I've tried to parameterize them a bit at the bottom here. So these A, C, D, and E are kind of legacy naming conventions from the older study. But there are some key differences. So one question, for instance, is which school goes first in terms of prioritization? Do we reconstruct Mitchell first and then look at Pollard later, or in the reverse order? Another question is how big will Mitchell be? So the size of Mitchell will in some ways dictate whether or not we need additional elementary school space somewhere else. And so that is kind of how the conversation about High Rock being or serving as an elementary school plays into this. So in each of these scenarios, except scenario A, High Rock would be, except scenarios A and E, High Rock would be used as an elementary school rather than as a 6th grade school. Go ahead, Louise.
So before the school committee goes down that road, they understand that creating a new elementary school means redistricting?
Yes, they know that. And in fact, it may mean redistricting twice because you once when the Mitchell population is housed at High Rock, and then a second time when you're redistricting across 6 elementary schools when you have a new Mitchell and a High Rock. So you're right that redistricting would have to be a part of the equation.
Moving kindergartners for, was it 1 year or 2 years to Pollard, caused huge amounts of discussion. And that wasn't even district, like we weren't changing districts.
Who's happy we don't have kids in the school right now?
I certainly am. So just to foreshadow, there actually is going to be a community discussion on February 8th, and the superintendent asked me to invite all of you to that from 7 to 8. So yes, school community will have input on all of these factors. So this is how it's laid out. There are dependencies. If Mitchell goes first, the way it's laid out is that 6th grade would remain at High Rock, whereas the way it is structured in these scenarios, if we do Pollard first, it would be rebuilt as a 6 through 8 center, where the High Rock students, the 6th grade students currently at High Rock would instead be moved to the Pollard campus. And then there are other questions about would an Elliott addition be needed? So in scenario E, it's supposed that with only a 4-section Mitchell, you may still need more classrooms, and that an addition at Elliott might be needed far in the future. And the last parameter is when or if to seek MSBA participation in the first project. So there's been a lot of discussion about whether it's realistic to expect that Needham would be invited to participate with MSBA. And there's been discussion about the length of time that it takes to go through that process. And some people have suggested that maybe it would be worth it to go on our own to fund it entirely on Needham's dime rather than go through the time to submit and apply to the MSBA at the risk of being rejected.
So if they reject us, they'll reject us right away. What does it, John, don't they have the application process and then within that application process?
Well, the statement of interest, but there's no way they're going to reject a rebuild of a Mitchell 75-year-old school. I feel pretty confident that we would have a hard time convincing them on Pollard, but I just see no way that the MSBA would not accept a rebuild of Mitchell.
So
I agree with John, and I also think it would be foolish for the town not to apply.
that was something actually that the consultant store in Whittier mentioned several times, that Mitchell had been the MSBA's top priority of all the schools for a long time, even ahead of Hillside. So we actually had to convince them that of the merits of doing the Sunita Williams ahead of doing the Mitchell. Another thing they did mention, though, is that the consultants, if Needham decided to do Pollard first, turn into a 6 through 8 center, and turn High Rock into an elementary school, the consultants believed that might, from the MSB's perspective, solve the Mitchell problem. Being able to move, not endorsing this, but being able to move the Hillside population to High Rock would mean that you no longer have students at Mitchell. But that is not an option that's being entertained in these 4 right now. So I'm just mentioning it to say that the MSBA has its own priorities and its own way of looking at things.
Josh, in that scenario, what happens? Who pays for Pollard?
If Pollard goes first?
Yeah.
So in scenarios C or D, there are 2 scenarios where Pollard would go first. In scenario C, it's assumed that MSBA would participate. And I think in the past, MSBA has had, I think, between 20-25% reimbursement of the costs. There's another scenario D where the idea is that Needham would bear the entire cost of that Pollard project. And if we were to do Mitchell at a future date, then we would potentially seek to participate with the MSBA then.
Is there a price tag on that? Are we talking like $20 million or?
Yeah, there are price tags. Okay, so let's get to cost before we look at the exact costs. I want to make sure it's clear what's included and what's not excluded. So there are two big line items in the scenarios, just a cost line item and a capital improvement plan line item. So for the cost, that includes design, construction, owner and construction contingencies, FF&E costs at $2,400 per student, and a 4.5% escalation per year from 2022. So it's assuming that you would have that escalation per year. And that is maybe the main reason why some of these numbers are very large. But it does exclude any additional operating costs that would follow occupancy. So for instance, if there were a sixth elementary school that would incur additional operating costs that are not included here. The second component is the CIP, and that's maximum capital maintenance costs for an existing building over an assumed period of time before construction. So if if for instance, Pollard were to be rebuilt first and you wanted to continue maintaining Mitchell, there would be costs to continue to maintain Mitchell until it is reconstructed. So those are the capital improvement costs. So here's a scenario A. It's status quo in the sense that the grade configuration remains the same. Sixth grade would remain at High Rock. You have Mitchell going first, then Pollard, and then High Rock. In this scenario, because sixth grade is still at High Rock, there is a budget for $36.3 million to build a temporary elementary school on DeFazio, basically right behind the Pollard. I see Jim laughing. I know. I don't know how well this would go over with the community, but I also want to foreshadow a little bit. I don't know if there might be other temporary space available. My understanding is that Hillside would not be considered for temporary space for students in the future, but there was some discussion at last night's school committee meeting that maybe there would be consideration of that in the future. So I'm just unclear about whether that would be an option or not. So this is A, where Mitchell goes first, then Pollard, and then High Rock. And this would be a High Rock addition.
You may have misspoke, but when you said at DeFazio, and then you said behind Pollard, are you saying Pollard? Are you saying under the railroad tracks at DeFazio? Because I don't know where at DeFazio that would be.
My understanding is that it would be under the, well, not exactly under the railroad tracks, but past the railroad tracks, because it couldn't, if there was going to be a Pollard project, an addition at Pollard would take up much of that other space behind Pollard.
So where would it be at DeFazio? In the parking lot?
Or would it
no.
be on the baseball fields?
I think it would be on a field.
On a field. I object. All right, continue, Professor.
Sure.
In this, Josh, in this
Yeah, go ahead.
scenario, at the risk of like just turning over old dirt, but in this scenario, for putting a temporary space into Fazio, might we consider using Hillside as a temporary space since it has classrooms already?
Well, that's part of my uncertainty. I don't know because I've heard different things. I've heard that Hillside would not be considered as temporary space for students in the future, but the school committee discussed a potential warrant article last night that would upgrade the heating systems for Hillside as temporary swing space in the future. So I think that needs to be clarified. I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Scenario C, this would switch the order. Rather than having Mitchell go first, Pollard would be rebuilt first as a 6th through 8th grade center. And one of the advantages of actually having Pollard go first is that you don't need to build a temporary space as the other scenario assumed. So once the 6th through 8th center was rebuilt, there would be some minor adjustments done at High Rock, such as toilets that can accommodate kindergarteners. But that would be able to be done over the summer, essentially, so that it could be occupied by Mitchell students. So Mitchell students would be able to move into High Rock once the 6th grade students move into Pollard. And at that time, a Mitchell building could be built. And this assumes a 3-section Mitchell school. For context, the current Mitchell building is 4 sections, though its footprint is smaller than what a modern 4-section school would be. So there are several options. Each of these 4 options consider different sizes for Mitchell, whether it should be a 3-section, 4-section, or 5-section school. And by that, I mean, for each grade, how many classrooms are there? So a 3-section school will have 3 classrooms per grade. I suppose, if enrollment fluctuates a little bit, it could, change year to year slightly, but that's the general size that the school would be.
Josh, question?
Yeah.
If Mitchell and the chart you showed earlier in terms of some of their infrastructure was all red, and so that stays red until kids, I guess, go into the place and at 2036. So the amount of contingency or the amount of money to keep that alive, what would that be? You referenced earlier in your presentation.
Oh, so this is the capital improvement cost of maintaining Mitchell until or through to maintain Mitchell while it's occupied, but before it's reconstructed. So in this scenario, you would only need to maintain Mitchell through about 2030, because at that time it would be vacated and the students would be housed at High Rock. And so this 4.8 million is the maximum cost. It's not to say that it couldn't be lower, but the reason why there's a maximum is because once you exceed for Mitchell $1.8 million over a 3-year period, then it triggers codes where you have to update things like sprinklers and accessibility. Go ahead, Louise.
Architectural Access Board.
Thank you.
But I
Thank you,
but I
Jim.
think that makes the case for why Mitchell can't be the second project. Right? It's like if you're going to now limit it because we don't want to upgrade to meet code, that tells us something about the building.
So I think I understand what you're saying. Pollard has similar, Pollard also has the same, a similar limit. So it can't exceed 5.7 million over 3 years, but I guess it's a higher limit. So what you're saying is if something catastrophic, for instance, were to happen, we would be much more hamstrung if it were to happen at Mitchell than if it were to happen at Pollard. Is that what you're saying?
Why is Pollard 5.7?
It's relative to the value of the building.
Yeah, that's what I thought. That seems awfully low for Pollard, but.
So, yeah, so if something were to force the town, if something were catastrophic were to happen and the town were forced to spend more than $1.8 million over 3 years on Mitchell, for instance, in all likelihood, there would be more investment that would be needed to bring the school up to code. Go ahead, Dick.
Nope.
Oh, okay. The other two, D and E, are in some ways variations on the other two. So D is a variation on C, where really the main difference is that you're pursuing Pollard as a first project, but not going through the MSBA. So that means you can potentially do it sooner because you don't have to wait for the MSBA. and potentially you can spend that extra time that you would spend with the MSBA actually focusing on Mitchell. So that could accelerate when you're able to start the Mitchell project. So Pollard, again, would go first as a 6 through 8 center. Mitchell would be able to be reconstructed, and High Rock would be used as a temporary space while Mitchell is being reconstructed for those students. And this is what Louise was mentioning about redistricting. So there's certainly one redistricting that would likely, well, actually it depends. You could have one redistricting if you're just moving Mitchell to High Rock here, or the town could choose just to bus the entire Mitchell population to High Rock and not redistrict. I think there are multiple options. Go ahead, Jim.
Okay.
And the cost of transportation.
I don't, yeah, and the fact that you can't get drivers, but I'm no expert on this, but it seems to me that Mitchell needs to be done first. It's the one in most need of repair, and it gives us flexibility to try and take care of the other projects. So I don't understand why they're just not focusing on that. It looks like the MSBA favors the project because of how old the building is. So that means more funds to the town and less funds from the taxpayer. So it just seems to me, I think they're perseverating, and I think that they should just, try and look at big picture rather than get into the weeds. The second thing I would say, and obviously, I guess I'm somewhat biased, any suggestion that we take over the fields that were constructed in 2009, 2010 is an absolute insult to all of the people that raised $5.5 million of non-taxpayer funds to renovate DeFazio and Memorial. It's outrageous, outrageous. So for them to even talk about that is infuriating to me. So in any event, I hope that they go with Mitchell, and then I hope they figure out how the pieces fall into place after that.
Thanks, Jim. There is one more thing that I forgot to mention. There is a program, and I am probably not going to do it justice. I apologize. There's a programmatic desire to have 6th grade on the same campus as the 7th through 8th graders. So that was expressed by the principals of both schools. I don't know the details as well to express that position well enough, but that is a strong desire from the school
it's a
department.
changing of an opinion, Josh, because they came before us in 2007, 8.
I was on the school committee.
Okay, and I was on the Board of Selectmen, and they said
And
this
John was on the PMBC or whatever.
We've got 3 people who were part of that discussion who said, this is not temporary. This is the future. A 6th grade learning center. And we all pushed back on it. We said, wait a minute, what about transitions? That was the big consultant word of the time, transitions. So we got a kid transitioning from the 5th to the 6th and the 6th to the 7th. That's not good for that age group, transitions. And each one of them, Steve Theals was there before me, Joe Barnes was there before me, said, oh no, this is it, fantastic, we're ready to go. This is the future. So the suggestion by these 2 principals that now it's all changed, again, it's insulting. It's insulting to the people of Needham. It's insulting to us.
It's also hugely expensive to backtrack. And it doesn't make any sense to do that.
Plus, not the other issue that I have with that is that I think it would be wholeheartedly unpopular and not supported by the residents who send their children to High Rock and love it.
I think we'll find out on February 8th.
No, I know that we'll find
February 8th
out.
is one
We've like
meeting.
danced around this issue for since this school master plan was first developed. And somehow the school committee and Dr. Gutenkans believe that this is the way to go. And I just think they're going to get a lot more resistance than they anticipate.
And with all due respect to the school superintendent, he wrote the memos explaining why a sixth grade center would be fine when Steve Thiel retired in his first year as superintendent.
So,
Love to
Yeah.
ask
go
Josh a
ahead, Rick.
question. In the context of talking about Pollard going first, was there any conversation of where Emery Grover and Hillside fit in to all of that, if the town is going to eat that bill on its own?
Emery Grover is not eligible for MSBA funding. MSBA will not reimburse for
Right.
administrative space.
No, that's my question. Did they see the dynamic of having Pollard being footed by the residents of the town, and then also Emery Grover and Hillside preparation for temporary space for admin? Where does all of that fit into this master plan?
Frankly, the Emery Grover wasn't part of the discussion.
Yeah, Rick, they pulled the wool over our eyes. They didn't tell town meeting what the whole proposal was. They only got up there and spoke one building at a time. It was an affront to town meeting, but you know, nobody is going to call them on it. But you're right. You're 100% right, Rick.
At least we should add that to the mix here in terms of discussion. We really can't keep pushing this under the rug. We really can't. And now we got to put sprinklers in Hillside. Any event, I would think that would have to play into this scenario. Not so much with Mitchell, if the MSBA is going to help take care of some of that, but if in this scenario,
well, I mean, if the
Marie and
MSBA
Hillside
even
have to be
covers,
on this diagram.
I mean, even if the MSBA covers 20%, that's still a hefty price tag. I mean,
Right.
So I don't think we can discount the cost. So
Yeah, I think when.
Why would MSBA only cover 20%?
so based upon their reimbursement of Sunita Williams, I think.
So the reason we got so little for Sunita Williams is because we went way off of their blueprint.
I didn't know that.
We avoided Mitchell and built a brand new school.
And then we added all these other
Owens,
things that are
Pulver.
non-reimbursables to the project.
Josh, can I make a recommendation that when school committee goes to the town and shows them and walks them through all of this, and I'm sure they'll fix it so it makes it more understandable, Emery and Hillside have to be in those diagrams. They just cannot be excluded from their master plan.
Yeah. As for Hillside, I don't know what the plan is for Hillside. It's under the select board's jurisdiction right now, but I've heard last night that the superintendent discuss perhaps using it as school swing space in the future, but it's very uncertain.
Okay.
I won't go through this one in detail. This is, again, just spreading out the buildings even farther apart to spread out the costs. But again, it's a situation where Mitchell would go first, and both Mitchell and Pollard would seek MSBA funding. So I think it's important to just note that the parameters that haven't yet been decided. I think we've actually discussed most of these. So whether Mitchell or Pollard goes ahead of the other, which one should go first, is something that really has to be decided, because that's a major inflection point, or decision point among these options. Whether High Rock is continued as a 6th grade center and Pollard is 7th or 8th grade, or whether there should be a grade configuration and merge the 6th through 8 into one campus. And then, as Rick was mentioning, what's the future of the Hillside School Department? So this is this was discussed at the school committee meeting last night, that there is a proposed 2022 annual town meeting warrant article to appropriate $275,000 for repair and upgrade to the Hillside heating system. that would allow for continued use of swing space by the school department. It's unclear to
Can I
me
have
what that means.
a question on each of these three, either collectively or individually?
Sure.
Who will be making these decisions, and when are they expected to be made?
So the superintendent outlined for me what he would like to do. He would like to have, and maybe I'll just move to next steps. What he would like to do is have the family meeting on February 8th, and then later in February, early March, to have the school committee eliminate one or more options. I think if the finance committee is going to have a say or a recommendation, I think it should probably be before the school committee, well, not to the exclusion of any other point in time, but I think it's important for the finance committee to express an opinion before any decisions about excluding or removing any options occur. I think another question is about the the debt financing. So we discussed that with Dave earlier. I want to get as precise information as possible for Dave in order to be able to do these debt calculations. So I've asked Dorian Whittier to provide a breakout of the component costs for each project across each scenario. I realize that's a lot of work for Dave to do it across all four, but I think it would be important to discuss whether we want to determine which scenarios which scenarios we should provide debt forecasting scenarios for, or whether we should only provide debt forecasting scenarios for the scenarios that the school department prioritizes. That's just the order. I think it's better for us to express our opinions sooner rather than later.
And how do we do that? Do we do that by asking to go to one of their meetings and present our concerns? Or, I mean, we're doing it here tonight, and I'm sure we're going to do it in other meetings that we have, but what's the mechanism? For example, to say something like my own personal opinion, which is that we should be focusing on Mitchell and what the swings, how we can get the most manageable swing space for that time period that those children will be out of that school. That's just my own personal opinion. I'm sure others on the committee have their own opinions as well. It's one thing for us to say at these meetings, how do we get it across that, to others that those are the concerns and questions that we have?
So if there's a consensus, I think I'm happy to work with Louise to craft a letter to the school committee so that they can take it into consideration. I think we should, also, certainly attend the February 8th meeting to listen in. We can certainly offer to have a presentation in front of them and a discussion in front of the school committee. One of the questions I have about making a recommendation about Mitchell going first is that it's just based upon our feelings. We're probably based upon the age of the school primarily.
Well, to me, it's on all those red lights. There was the very first slide.
Yeah.
Every circle was red. To me, that's the first slide that we started with. And to think that you have a building that has all red lights and you're not tackling that first, I can't get past that.
Yeah.
In addition to the fact that one, we do have a good chance of getting MSBA funding for, and we have a good chance of getting it approved quickly in town.
Yep.
I think it's a hard one to argue against.
Right.
Whereas changing grade configurations and doing all this other stuff is much more difficult.
Right.
I think,
Josh,
go ahead, Rick.
In quoting a recent past politician, it seems to be getting into good trouble. Can we take our position, stick it in a white paper, and send it to every town meeting member? Have to do discussion with committees and all like that, but be sure that town meeting member knows exactly our position and why.
Yeah, I think for something like that, I'd want to take a vote and be very clear about what our position is. But yes, we can.
I think if we were going to do something like that too, though, we need to make sure that we have a debt financing schedule against
Absolutely.
the proposal that we're supporting.
But see that, so there are two things. So just suppose that we identify Mitchell with having all of these red dots, and we think that that's a good reason to do that first. I have a question for the school committee and the school department about swing space. So what is the plan for swing space? Would it be building a temporary space as suggested in the plans, or is there an alternate option to use Hillside as swing space, which I thought had been ruled out, but now I'm getting mixed signals. So I would like to ask that of the school department.
I just don't understand why it's been ruled out. I don't understand why it's been ruled out, particularly if in the warrant, they're going to be asking for funds to upgrade the heat and ventilation system.
My understanding is that it had been ruled out because of maybe the environmental concerns on that site. But that is, it sounds to me like perhaps that thinking has changed. I don't know.
What are the environmental concerns?
On the Hillside site?
Yeah,
I
so
don't-
we sent kids to that site for years.
My kids all went through that, and I've heard this story a zillion times. When it suits the situation, you'll hear that the ventilation is very effective and there's no risk. When it doesn't suit it, it says it's a little risky to put anybody in there. So that's what I'm very respectful of what people are trying to do, but I've heard both sides of the story for years and years and years. So the environmental answer, I think, is a little bit bogus, or at least needs to be further clarified on why it would be risky. Otherwise, we have a building there that for 2 years or 3 years, whatever the construction time frame, makes perfect sense to be swing space.
Yeah.
We'd have to put money into it. There's no doubt we have to put money into it, but it's much faster, easier, and cheaper to put money in that building than build a new building on existing fields, which would then have to be repaired too. So,
which are under the jurisdiction of Park and Rec in the first place.
I'm not sure that area is not. That area is under the DeFazio is split 3 ways, and that the part that they're talking about, I think, is under the school department.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
They
Tom's
made
right.
a couple of years ago and brought us in at the last minute after the decisions had been made.
But to Carol's other point about the debt financing, that I think that's going to take a while. So I think we're in a tricky position. If we wanted to ask Dave to do debt forecasting for all 4 scenarios, we may not have them in time to make a recommendation. Whereas if we prioritize only 1 or 2 scenarios, first of all, I don't know how we would select which ones, but second, then we would only be able to comment on those particular scenarios.
But I think we can still, we don't need the down to the dollar. I think we can certainly compare.
I mean, we're talking about more of a quick and dirty.
Yeah.
Debt, debt schedule and what the 3% and 10% levels look like against the 4 scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
Or you could sort of flip it around and say, what can we afford? And then how much build through the 3 and 10, say how big of a building can we possibly build?
But then we won't build anything.
We're very close to them. What did I have? I think I had the figures in here. Yeah, I mean, right now we're already over the 10%, and we're very close to the 3%. So, okay, so let me stop sharing, I guess. What steps do we think the committee should take at this point? What information should we wait on before making a decision on? I mean, for me, I still want more information about swing space at Hillside. Are we getting too ahead of ourselves to express an opinion about prioritizing Mitchell first? Explain to me why not, Louise.
Because Mitchell is, if you look at the definition of what is wrong with Mitchell, those systems have already failed.
Yeah, I think
It's
maybe-
so
I don't know
it's
if you-
not, you know, they're not, yeah, they're plodding along. They failed already.
Go ahead, Rick. Excuse me, Dick.
And moreover, there's,
Go
I
ahead.
think there is huge burden of proof against anything that says we're gonna forego MSBA financing. I mean, that's a
Yeah.
huge benefit so that there's a huge burden of proof against that as a potential solution.
So during the discussions we had, there were there was discussion that it's certainly not guaranteed. By seeking MSBA participation, it's not guaranteed that they will be funding it. And I think there were, some examples, like I think Lexington may have been one, of a town that goes repeatedly to the MSB and repeatedly gets rejected. And I think the worry is that by delaying, or not purposely, but by seeking participation with the MSBA and risking being rejected, that would delay the project and thereby increase the costs based upon this 4.5% escalation, such that maybe the project would in the end be as much or more than the net would be if MSBA participated.
But don't you just apply and they either tell you or reject you? I don't see what the delay is.
No. Our track record has been pretty good with the MSBA. So why do we assume we're going to be Lexington?
I think the assumption is based on the fact that because we've been so good with the MSBA, that the MSBA would prefer to spread their dollars around. I'm trying to there is a slide in the school master plan extension that discusses the process. Let me pull that up. Go ahead, Rick.
Just a thought, might we put forward an opinion or a scenario and just have placeholders for questions that we have, such as, swing space and like that, and begin to drive some of the discussion? Because I'm curious to what the parents are going to say when they go to families and say, what school do you want? I can't imagine they'll be shy of all emotion and all pure dollar. So I would love to see what that's going to be, but I think we should get out in front of all of that, not try and step on any school committee's toes to kind of, which really isn't our place, but certainly state a position alongside of them. And maybe the sooner we do that, rather than, I think Dick's point is well taken. Not to think that MSBA money is going to be valuable to us and choose another option. It truly doesn't make much sense, but just an initial thought, because we didn't do that last time. We let our position known, and then we let town meeting kind of carry on. And maybe this time we can learn from that and maybe get out in front and make our opinion known, so people can begin to think about it and talk about it, not just on town meeting floor.
I just want to make sure that our opinion is based upon the dollars and cents and not, I don't want to stray into programming or education.
Nor I. That's why Dick's Dick's position in terms of Mitchell leading with SBA money seems a practical way, at least to begin conversation.
Yeah, perhaps I can phrase it as a question then. Given the deficiencies at Mitchell compared to other schools, what is what are the compelling arguments to not put Mitchell first?
Or put another way, what are our compelling reasons to have Mitchell first? Or is is that presumptuous on our part? Because we're not really running the business.
Well, yeah, I feel like we don't have, we have a general sense that the MSBA would support Mitchell, but in terms of the actual costs, I'm less certain that we have a firm footing there.
Okay.
And let me share my screen. This, in terms of the process, this is, so there's a statement of interest that's submitted, and for up to 2 years, there's a project team that's formed in conjunction with the MSBA. Then there are feasibility studies, schematic designs, and then there's a funding of the project. So between, I guess, I think the real question is in these initial 2 years, would we go, 2 years and then learn that it could be rejected at that time, before even getting to feasibility? If so, then that, I think is viewed as 2 years that's potentially wasted. Is this different than other people's understanding of the process? Go ahead, Louise.
Yeah, my understanding was not that it would take 2 years. But I do think that right now is the time when the MSBA is taking applications.
Right. So in the initial capital plan, by initial, I mean last year's capital plan, there was a plan to submit, or at least pursue design funding at the May town meeting of this year. But I think that has been pushed back. The school department is now planning to, whichever scenario they choose, they're not looking for funding until May of 2023 next year.
So if that's the case, then the statement of interest submitted now would be within MSBA timeline.
Perhaps. I don't know. Yes, I don't know if there is an intention to submit an SOI this year.
Josh, I think one of the things we need to have on the table is what is the probable amount of MSBA funding that would be at issue? If it's 20 to 25% of the project, which is my memory of what we were talking about in terms of the Sunita Williams School. And I'm trying to remember, what was the face amount number for Mitchell?
You can just use 100 million, I think is just, you could just use that just for discussion purposes.
So it's $20 million that we would be making a decision to walk away from. I have trouble understanding the logic of that.
Yeah, so if I could just play the other side for a second. I think if you have to delay a project because you're banking on that funding but end up not getting it, then those escalation, the increased cost by waiting could end up being 20 million or more.
Well, 5% a year, if you're talking 2 years,
And the project is not going to be ready.
5% a year, 2 years is $10 million.
Right.
And what's the difference between if we were, in terms of the money, if we get approval now versus waiting because we think in 5 years we'll get approval? Are we breaking even on that 20 million? Anyway, if we wait and get the approval 5 years from now, the 20 million is, if we roll it forward, it's not such a big difference in not getting it now and building the school now. But
Yeah, we can. I can say that in the letter. Let's just be careful about how we calculate the risks and benefits of not going with the MSBA.
But mechanically, the town, we can also have the school committee request funding at an earlier town meeting while the process is going on. And it actually will shorten some of those timelines. Because some of those timelines are going to town meeting and getting approval for what MSBA has agreed for the town to do.
I think that's not, as far as I know, there's no planning, at least this year, to seek funding from town meeting for either Mitchell or Pollard. Go ahead, Dick.
And the other thing is, what's the impact on the other capital projects that are under consideration, like the DPW, et cetera?
The DPW never gets done.
Yeah.
My understanding is that there's some rethinking about how DPW can be in a more distributed way. So operations can be distributed at the headquarters and partly at other buildings in town as well, so that there may not be need for a new headquarters to be built. Go ahead, Carol.
That would be good.
I don't have anything.
And then, okay, so then I guess my last question in terms of the facility, what are we calling it? Excuse me, the debt financing scenarios. I guess what I'll do, since I've asked the consultants for a breakout, but they haven't yet been able to provide it. I can circulate to Dave these top level numbers and the dates that are in the packet, and see, I can have a conversation with him and see if maybe there's a quick and dirty way of seeing ballpark what impact it would have on debt financing, knowing that if there were more details at a later date, we can go into more detail at that time. Is that
very, very important that we get to? It shouldn't take a lot to have a directionally accurate, a directionally sound sense of, A and C make sense, D might, and E absolutely doesn't, or whatever we conclude. I don't think you need to have absolute precision to come up with a sense in that.
Yeah,
I agree with Dick. That's all we need to have a recommendation.
okay. I don't want to, I guess, I don't know if we need to make a recommendation at this point. Even if we had all of that information right now, I think it would be too early to make recommendation.
But if
Yeah,
we don't, then we're
don't-
going to end up in a
No, but,
potentially adversarial.
Yeah, I think it's not too early to make strong requests as to the process and what the issues are that need to be addressed.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, then I can make that clear, and make it clear what what information we still don't have,
Yeah.
and what information would
So
be
let's-
needed.
Let's touch on some of the ones we've talked about. One is turning it back on MSBA. Second is all of a sudden we reversed conclusions on High Rock as a 6th grade thing. What's the justification for that? And there are a couple of others we've kicked around here.
Well, 3
That's
was what 3 really is. Why can't we use Hillside for swing space?
Yep.
Yeah, so I agree with the MSBA, the Hillside question. I think in terms of the 6th grade center,
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
would stay away from that. I don't think, I think we all have our opinions and strong thoughts on it.
that's really a
but-
school department
But that's
decision.
not a money per se issue, whereas I think the other two definitely are.
I agree with John.
Okay, I don't remember the difference in,
It's
That
a
doesn't
money
have an
issue if
impact
we're
on the
still
cost.
paying, yeah. It's a money issue if we're still paying the debt service on the decision that was made to go with the 6th grade center.
What debt was there? But there was debt issued to convert that to a 6th grade center?
Yeah, and that one, the town chose not to pursue MSBA funding for.
I look into.
But I think it was $20 million or something. It wasn't.
Well, Louise, they're not looking to abandon the building, so they're gonna still use it for school use. So it was sort of walking a tight line there, but
Yeah, certain things were done a certain way because it was a sixth grade center.
yeah.
Okay, and then the other question we just had was, Mitchell, the decision about doing Mitchell before Pollard. I think there are a lot of factors, not just the status of the buildings. So in other words, the other factors are if there is a desire to combine sixth grade into Pollard, then and if there's a need to build a temporary space to house Mitchell, then those might be factors that push doing Pollard first rather than Mitchell first, because in that sense, you get to avoid a temporary space. So I guess all I'm saying is I think it's important to ask the question about why, maybe just enumerate the other factors other than just the building conditions at Mitchell and Pollard that would determine which building goes first. But keeping in mind that that there are other factors.
Yeah, well, not to reopen the whole section, but isn't one of the main factors of doing Pollard first is so they can empty High Rock to use it as a swing space?
Yeah, exactly.
Leads to, we need to answer the question, why can't Hillside be that swing space? Because that sort of changes that element.
Yeah. So then I think that the Hillside question, the MSBA question, I think those answer most of the questions that we have. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I also think it gets the dialogue out there. I mean, this not only asking the questions, but getting this sort of out from just a finance committee discussion, that so that the town as a whole starts to get aware of these issues and get these discussions going. I think it's important. Rick mentioned it earlier in one of his comments about how if you just leave the discussion up to the town meeting floor, you're or any of us doing a service to the taxpayers.
So yeah, at this point, I think I just want to ask these questions of the school committee and the school department. I don't think I don't think we're at a stage where we're advocating for anything. So I don't think there's a need to inform town meeting members.
I didn't mean it that we're advocating. I think that we are disseminating information and observations.
So John, do you think that these observations are worth disseminating to town meeting members at this time?
Well, I think sometime between now and town meeting, I would like to have that discussion amongst this group. Yes.
Yeah. So I think there have to be more conversations.
I'm not saying tonight, but there has to be more. Yeah. I would think that is something between now and then that I would like our group to consider.
Yeah, I think at some point between now and town meeting we can do that, but I think now is too early.
Agreed.
Okay. Okay, I think this is clear. This helps me think about things. Anyone else have anything they want to add? Thank you. I appreciate the conversation.
Thank you, Josh, for all your time on this.
Yeah, thanks for leading us along on this.
Absolutely. So the last agenda item are anything unanticipated or committee updates. Does anyone have anything they want to raise? Yeah, go ahead, Carol.
Just reminding everybody that there's a housing listening session tomorrow night at 7. As town meeting members, did you all get that notification?
I got an email.
Yes.
Yep. You did? Okay, good. Because I had Louise sent it out too as well. For some reason I actually as a town meeting member didn't get it. But so if you'd like to listen in, that'd be great.
Yeah, I hope it's a good discussion. Any other updates? Go ahead, Louise.
Just one quick point. The NEF trivia bee
is
Oh.
coming up in March 10th. So I will tell everyone about that if we want to. It says it's going to be held in the Needham cafeterias. I guess they're going to try to do it live, but
Okay.
something to think about if anybody.
Yeah,
likes
usually we,
trivia.
It's
usually we put a
trivia,
team
not
together.
spelling.
How did it go from?
Trivia.
Tough.
Well, spelling bees were hard. They always gave us the hardest questions.
But,
They gave the kids all the
3 years
easy
out of
ones.
cycle for trivia.
Louise,
Dick,
how are you? in
Dick
trivia?
deals big picture, not trivia.
What are the categories?
Doesn't say yet.
Planning
Municipal,
board,
municipal
finance,
finance for
select
5.
board.
Right.
The DPW stuff.
Yeah.
Oh.
Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second,
Roll call. Carol,
Yes.
Rick,
Yes.
Dick,
yes.
Louise,
Yes.
Tom,
Yes.
John,
Yes.
and the chair votes yes. Good night, everyone.